Okay, so today I wanted to talk about silence and why is it an important thing to include in your life. When I was a kid, I remember going to a museum which was doing an exhibit about a culture called Paracas, and this society had a style of art that I thought it was really interesting, because it was called horror to the void or horror to the empty. They would cover their ceramics in paint and in drawings as much as they could in order to, let's say, not leave any empty space. And I always carried that idea as an interesting thing. Like, why would somebody do that? Why would somebody be so afraid of space, of nothing? And then I remember hearing, I guess, Aristotle's famous quote, "Nature abhors a vacuum," which, in a sense, let's say, has the same principle. But it was when I studied Eastern philosophies that I became really, I guess, or I gained perspective on the matter because I understood where that line of thought was coming. And just for the purposes of this, I'm assuming that the art style, Horror to the Void, was not, let's say, the way that the Paracas culture understood it, but the way that Western culture attributed a name or a category to that art style. So the main difference between Western and Eastern philosophies for me is that for Western culture, the world or reality is a combination of separate things that it can interact with each other. But for Eastern philosophies and religions and like even modes of thinking, there's, let's say, though there's an apparent separation of what we call things, it is all a whole integrated system of interrelated aspects. And the difference that creates in the way that we approach life and thinking is vast because, and I'm going to use like the idea of opposites to explain this. For Western culture, we tend to see opposites as two different things that are opposed against each other, and that one is trying to destroy the other or like conquer the other. That's why the motifs of evil versus good or bad versus evil, or no, that doesn't make any sense. Dark versus light, evil versus good, left versus right, and so on, have such let's say, a mythological power to them because it's always presumed that there are two different things that are trying to oppose each other, and one should conquer the other. So we're always in the danger of being defeated by evil, or we should always strive to make, let's say, the light side win, right? But for Eastern philosophy, their idea is more of balance in the sense that the whole yin yang principle applies because they understand that in order for good to be good and bad to be bad, or light to be light and dark to be dark, the other side needs to exist simultaneously, or rather, not that it needs to exist, that they exist in combination. And that's the whole idea. This whole integrated system is one single thing that includes two aspects of it, in the same way that a magnet has a positive and negative pole, but it's one whole thing, a whole system. And even if you break it apart, then those two independent pieces become a negative and positive pole by themselves. So what happens if you don't have that idea, which is, I guess, one of the best things that we can take out of Eastern philosophy? We have this confronting idea, and what we do is we tend to side with one aspect of these two like interrelated poles, and we dismiss the other or characterize the other as undesirable, or that it's not worthy of attention, or that it should be defeated or vanquished or whatever. And what this creates is basically the whole idea of fight against the dark, the war against evil and whatnot. And it has a logic of its own, but if you think it through, like the only way you're able to differentiate up from down is because there's down in order to appreciate what's up. And the only way for a mountain to exist if there's a valley like next to it or like below it. If there's no valley, there's no mountain. If there's no wave, trough, there's no wave. So what does this have to do with silence? I remember understanding this because I like music, and music has a symbol for silence, meaning that it has been in music we've understood the importance of the empty, of the void, of the negative principle, because it's an essential part of the composition in itself. You ask any musician, and silence is not only a part that they, let's say, consciously use or actively use in order to make music. Without it, it would just be a mess of sound. Rhythm is it's the interaction between sound and silence. Sound in itself is a combination of sound and silence in terms of vibration. But we don't understand that in other aspects of our lives, or in other venues of life. So what we've done in terms of I guess our minds is identify with one side of the pole. And I'm just going to explain it in terms of reality has two aspects that we normally use in order to interact with it. There's the direct experience reality, that, let's say, everything that's here right now that we experience by itself. And then there's language. And language is, let's say, the symbolic system that we've created in order to apprehend the unspeakable reality in ways that we can express or use functionally through a communicational device, let's say like speaking, to relate to each other. Also, the capacity of defining allows us to, let's say, pinpoint exactly what we want, and or makes us aware of what's going on. That's why in certain languages there's concepts or feelings that in others haven't identified correctly. So we have to add words or concepts or create, let's say, a figurative structure of speech in order to attain the same sensation that's been pinpointed by language in others by a specific word. So, given the fact that our society has, let's say, a fascination with one side of the poles, because we don't understand that they're a related system, as I'm mentioning, I believe that what is going on is that language has taken so much preponderance in our lives, in the way that we interact with ourselves, let's say internally, with others, and with reality in general, that we've left or pushed aside the negative principle, which is, let's say, reality for what it is. And we don't understand how that affects us. We identify consciousness as thought for the most part, because when we think, we are aware of what we're doing or what we're thinking or what we're like trying to express. But thinking and consciousness are not the same thing, and awareness and thinking are not the same thing either. So when you're in a situation or in an environment, what we've learned as a society over and over since we were a kid is to, let's say, deploy the symbolic system that language is in order to be able to understand what's going on. The problem is you do that too much or enough, and you start to, let's say, lose sight of the thing in itself, meaning reality as a direct experience. And you only see it in terms of what language is able to tell you. That's why there's a lot of people that cannot appreciate something unless there's something to be said about it, or that it's categorized in a way. So even, let's say, even Cartesian philosophy, to an extent, because it's not completely in that way, the famous idea cogito ergo sum, which is I think therefore I am, it is because it's my thoughts that make me aware. Though the opposite principle can be said to have the same validity, which is I am, therefore I think. And the problem is that we don't understand that it's not one or the other, that it's simultaneous. But our language is structured in such a way that we tend to think of those two things as either or, instead of goes with. So consciousness goes with language. Human consciousness, at least, goes with language. And language goes with human consciousness. So there's no point in trying to, let's say, make one side of the argument win, but to understand the importance of each aspect. So given the fact that we're stuck between a rock and a hard place, we need to find a bridge to close that gap, or to be able to relate to both sides of the poles, meaning the linguistic symbolic system that we've created in order to communicate the direct experience reality. And that's why I believe that silence is so important. Because if you think about it, silence shuts one side and makes the other come back. And we live in a society that pretty much is doing the opposite. We barely see the world for what it is, and we only tend to relate to it and to others in terms of what we think. And this is not good, bad, better, or worse. It's just that it's who we are as a culture. But in order to find balance, the best thing that we can do is to, let's say, create a bridge create a bridge that sends us to the opposite side. And in order to go to the direct experience reality more, we have to stop doing what prevents us from getting there, which is thinking. Now, of course, meditation will be an obvious option. I think that a lot of people tend to stay away from it because they think it's a spiritual practice, but it's more of it's a process where you learn to have another modality of consciousness, meaning that if you think about your mind as a lake that is, let's say, reflecting what the exterior world is presenting you with, and let's say there are ripples on that lake, and that would be thoughts. So the ripples are, let's say, the ideas and every thought that you have in your head, and though they have a purpose of their own, they're distorting what's in front of you, meaning the environment that you're in, which includes people and even yourself in some sense. So meditation is the idea of stop the ripples by letting them dissipate. Now, it's hard because we've been accustomed to do something in order to stop stuff. So we tend to want to control our thoughts, to think about how to stop our thinking, which is another thought, or to be able to, let's say, concentrate in order to make them stop, which is yet another way to try to control it instead of letting it go. So we are a culture, like an anal retentive culture that doesn't want to let go of stuff. We want to control stuff. So meditation is a hard practice for most people because it confronts you with letting go of that which you feel is so close to you. I believe that even when at a given points in meditation is like if I stop thinking, I have this anxiety of having to think something because I'm so accustomed to relating that to my own consciousness, my own sense of being, that I cannot let that go. But the more I do it, the more I've realized that it's not that I disappear, but rather that the world recovers some of its preponderance and some of its importance around me. So I become engaged with the present moment, and that's the whole thing about Eastern philosophy at its core, I would say, which is being in the present moment, like detaching yourself from everything else so that you can be where you are and you can engage with what you're doing. And the trick for me has been to kind of like let go of trying to get somewhere or thinking about where I was or feeling that I have to push to do something, and rather just allow myself to feel more and more comfortable in the present moment until it's just there. And I realize, I don't have to do anything, to do the normal things that I would do in my life, in my everyday life. It doesn't mean that you're just catatonic, which is what people normally think about being, in a mystical state or whatever. It's more about just being so present that when you're enacting in the world, you are, let's say, not trapped in the usual way that you relate to it. So you're going to go back and forth between language and reality, or like being more prone to be living on one side or the other. But the idea is that if you create a balance between both sides, you're going to be able to have a better understanding of how each side of those opposites work. And I guess it's a more integrated way of living. I'm not going to say better or worse because it's fun to have to live on both sides, and I've lived on both sides. But it's a more integrated way of living. So yeah, that's why I think silence is so important. I think that maybe the whole idea of being afraid of the vacuum, or being afraid of the void, or the nature abhors the vacuum comes from the idea that it plays no part, or that it has no importance or meaning, but silence does, and nothingness does. But I guess it's counterintuitive. So yeah. Thanks for watching, and I'll put something somewhere, and I'll see you back. Thank you.